Let's talk about the triple T that you may find on an instrument approach plate. Seems to be a lot of discussion, a lot of misunderstanding of exactly what that means and what we should do about that. Reference for what I'm going to talk about comes from Air Force Manual 11217, Volume 1. Quick overview of what I'm going to talk about, a little review of IFR departures, the different methods of departing IFR, quick talk about the obstacle clearance surface and runway crossing height, take a quick look at low close-in obstacles, and then we'll get into talking about the triple T, what it means, and what are the various options that we have to deal with that. And then we'll, at the very end, talk a little bit about calculating our climb gradient performance, because that will work into this entire conversation. All right, IFR departures. One term that comes up a lot when we talk about departures is TIRPs. That stands for the Terminal Instrument Procedures, a group of specialists that sit down and do all of the IFR planning, looking at safety, looking at terrain clearance and avoidance, and coming up with all of the procedures and policies. Now, a quick review of the different ways to depart IFR. There are 6 of them. Most people use the acronym DOS no more. Diverse departure, obstacle departure procedures, standard instrument departures or SIDs, special ATC instructions, MAGCOM specific procedures, and non-standard takeoff minimums. Keep in mind that the only published departure procedures that can be found in FLIP are the ODPs and the SIDs. 2 of these that we're going to get into a lot with this discussion is the obstacle departure procedure and the non-standard takeoff minimums. All right, let's take a look at the obstacle clearance surface. The TIRP specialist will take the runway in question and we'll take a look at a 152 foot per nautical mile clearance plane. They're going to extend that out from the end of the runway, and they're going to check for any obstacles that might penetrate that. Trees, buildings, power lines, towers, mountains. They're also going to add a 48 foot per nautical mile required obstacle clearance above that. Add that up, that gives us a total of a 200 foot per nautical mile overall clearance plane that they're analyzing for obstructions. That's why our minimum climb gradient is always 200 foot per nautical mile. Now, if anything penetrates that 200 foot per nautical mile clearance plane, the TIRP specialist must provide us with some procedure to avoid the obstacle. Runway crossing height. The required height of the aircraft at the departure end of the runway. That's what that is. It varies on the airport we're talking about, who designed the approach, the terrain, obstacles, a lot of different variables. It could be anywhere between 0 to 35 feet AGL. Problem with this is we don't exactly know as pilots what that is planned for. 11217 says that Air Force and Navy non-joint use airfields, we're going to assume it's 0 feet AGL. So that 200 foot per nautical mile clearance plane that the TIRP specialist is using at a non-joint use Air Force and Navy field, that's going to begin from the surface at the departure end of the runway. Any other airport, 11217 says that we should plan to cross the departure end of the runway at 35 feet AGL. So if it's not published, the runway crossing height is not published in anything, and we're not at a Air Force or Navy non-joint use airfield, we're going to assume that 200 foot per nautical mile clearance plane begins at 35 feet above the departure end of the runway. Low close-in obstacles. Those are defined as obstacles that are surrounding the runway environment that would require a greater than 200-foot per nautical mile climb gradient up to 200-foot AGL at the departure end of the runway. Pilots have to consider these obstacles and make sure that our aircraft performance will allow us to clear those obstacles on departure. Those are not calculated into any obstacle departure procedure or any other procedure. And that's simply because that required climb gradient to miss them would be so great, we'd never be able to take off. So the TERP specialist is going to leave that to us to take a look at. If we determine that we cannot clear those obstacles, then we have to either depart on another runway, take a different ground track, or consult MAGCOM for guidance. All right, trouble T. So we put all this together. Trouble T means that we have an obstacle out there that penetrates that 200-foot per nautical mile clearance plane. And the TERP specialist has published procedures somewhere to help us avoid the obstacle. So we're going to take a look in the IFR minima section of the approach book and find out what exactly those procedures are. It could be as simple as listing what the low close-in obstacles are so we can plan our own avoidance. It could be publishing non-standard takeoff weather minimums, publishing minimum climb gradients, specific routing, some other combination, and there's a few other things we could do. So this is often misunderstood with students that say a trouble T means that there are non-standard takeoff minimums. That could be true, but not necessarily. As shown here, trouble T could mean any of these things exist. So a better answer to that question of what does a trouble T mean? It means that something is penetrating my 200-foot per nautical mile clearance plane, and procedures have been published for me to avoid it. That's a much better answer. All right, so let's take a look at some of these options. Let's start with that non-standard takeoff minimum. If we take a look at our example here in Orangeburg, South Carolina, it says takeoff minimums, runway 531, I need the weather of 501, 500-foot ceiling and 1 mile visibility in order to take off. What this is the see and avoid concept. This is written for civilian pilots. What it is telling me is that this obstacle that's out there is approximately 500 foot tall, and it's located about 1 mile past the departure end of the runway. Civilian pilots will use the see and avoid concept. They need to be able to see that obstacle in order to take off and then simply don't hit it. As Air Force pilots, we do not use that. We do not fly see and avoid concept. So as far as a non-standard takeoff minimum goes, this does not apply to me as an Air Force pilot. It does, however, apply to me as a restriction. I have to cross the departure end of the runway at or above that ceiling that's listed, 500 feet AGL. Now, if I can't do that, then I can't take off IFR on this runway. Regardless, Air Force pilots are going to use our AFI 11202 Vol 3 minimums for our takeoff weather. Take another look at, or a look at another way that our non-standard takeoff minimums could be written. This is at Gallup Muni in New Mexico, runway 6. It says for category A and B aircraft, the weather we need is a 1,300-foot ceiling and 2 miles of visibility to take off. But there's more verbiage after that now. It says, or standard takeoff minimums, as long as we have a minimum climb gradient of 300 foot per nautical mile until we get to 8,000 feet. So we would have to calculate our performance to make sure that we can do that climb gradient of 300 foot per nautical mile. And we'll talk about that at the end of these slides. If we are unable to either be at 1,300 feet by departure end, and that's pretty good ceiling, and we are also unable to make that 300 foot per nautical mile, then again, we would not be able to depart IFR from this runway. We would have to either use a different runway or wait for the weather to improve and depart under VFR. Obstacle departure procedure. This is a climb gradient greater than 200 knots or routing to avoid an obstacle. Again, when we go into the IFR minima section for the airport, in this example, Roanoke Regional, we would see where it says departure procedure. So there's my ODP, runway 15. Climb runway heading to intercept the Roanoke Vortex, radial 122 to 4,000 feet before proceeding on course. So as you can see, that lists of routing for our obstacle avoidance. What's interesting is if you look just above that, you'll see that there's a note with non-standard takeoff minimums. It says that on runway 6 and 33, NA for obstacles. And what that means is we cannot depart IFR from runway 6 or 33. We must comply with any ODP, whether it's a routing or a climb gradient, before we follow any other ATC routings or clearances. If we receive a special ATC clearance that says on departure, fly a certain heading, climb to a certain altitude, we would first apply this departure procedure, and then when it was complete, then we would start following those special ATC instructions. Now, we could have a combination of methods like we see here at Chesterfield County in Richmond, Virginia. We have takeoff minimums and a departure procedure. So remember, the takeoff minimums do not apply to us as takeoff minimums. So runway 15, civilian pilots need a ceiling of 800 feet and 1 mile. For us, that means we have to be at 800 feet above the departure end of the runway. Or our other option is we use our standard 11202 Vol 3 weather minimums for takeoff, but we are required then to climb at a rate of 280 feet per nautical mile till we get to 1,200 feet. So those are the non-standard takeoff minimums. Regardless of which one of those options we do, we still have to comply with the departure procedure for runway 15 that says climb runway heading to 1,200 feet before proceeding on course. So if there are both of these, like in this case, we have to comply with both of those. Vertical climb over airport. Now this requires special MAGCOM training and certification. It's basically a spiraling climb up to the published altitude, staying within a certain distance from the center of the airport, more than likely staying over the airport property, and maintaining VMC. That's kind of an important part of it. We still have to meet our 200 foot per nautical mile climb gradient. And if we take a look at our example here, Stevens Field in Pagosa Springs, we see it says takeoff minimums runway 19 or 1903 for climb and visual conditions. So those are the magic words, climb and visual conditions. However, that has to be directly associated with the ceiling and visibility. If all it said was climb and visual conditions, that would not be considered a vertical climb over the airport. Reduced takeoff runway length, another way that the TERP specialist could have us avoid obstacles. By artificially limiting the length of the runway, they force us or could force a pilot to take off a little bit sooner, therefore having a little bit more altitude by the time they get to the obstacle. Now, as pilots, we will not calculate our own RTRL procedure because we don't know what that controlling obstacle is that the TERP specialist is looking at. That's not shown necessarily on any approach plate or departure procedure. So if we take a look at our example, Lee County Regional has some non-standard takeoff minimums, and it says, or alternatively, we can use standard takeoff minimums and a normal 200 foot per nautical climb gradient. That sounds good. but takeoff must occur no later than 1,600 foot prior to the departure end of the runway. So that is the wording that kind of sets off this reduced takeoff runway length. Takeoff must occur no later than. Okay, so how do we apply these things? Well, anytime an aircraft is going to come off the runway surface, such as initial takeoff or touch and go, we have to comply with the treble T. What about a missed approach, you ask? Well, missed approach is still, TERP specialist is still going to plan that to use the same 200 foot per nautical mile clearance plane and 200 foot per nautical mile climb gradient that a normal takeoff does. So the treble T doesn't necessarily apply to the missed approach. Remember that the missed approach point is at or before the approach end of the runway in most cases, while our initial takeoff, we're looking at the departure end of the runway. So the TERP specialist in the first place has some additional distance that he can use until he gets to the obstacle. And that also starts not from the runway surface, but from our either decision altitude or MDA. If the TERP specialist decides that that obstacle is still a problem, he has a couple things he can do. Probably the first thing he's going to do is he's going to raise that decision altitude or that minimum descent altitude on the approach. Starts from a higher altitude in the first place. If he needs to use a higher climb gradient, then he will publish that in the published missed approach directions. So normally, we don't need to worry about that treble T if I'm doing a missed approach. But anytime I am going into a field, I want to know if there's a treble T, just in case I do have to do a touch and go or do a missed approach. I want to be familiar that there are some special procedures out there. All right, let's take a real quick look at our calculating our climb gradient. Let's say we have an ODP or a non-standard takeoff minimum that requires a 480 foot per nautical mile climb gradient. Using the 60-to-1 rule, which says that 1 degree of pitch will give us a 100-foot altitude change in 1 mile. So what angle is going to give us 480 feet altitude change in a mile? 4.8 degrees. But that is above level flight. We normally climb out at 160 knots indicated, and level flight at 160 is usually about 2 degrees nose high. So we need 4.8 degrees above that, or maintain 6.8 degrees nose high during our takeoff and departure. Now, think about a normal takeoff. Put our spinner on the horizon, we check for a 7 to 10 degree nose high attitude on our attitude indicator. So 6.8, we can do that. That's a pretty normal takeoff for us. So we can comply with the climb gradient. The catch here is that we have to make sure that we hold that 6.8 degrees during the gear and flap retraction and throughout the departure procedure until we get to the altitude specified in the departure procedure. So don't let that nose drop when the flaps come up. Be anticipating that. There we go. There's a quick review on the treble T. A couple other things to think about. Hope this helps. Have a good day.